I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. Your team isn't trying to sabotage your new corporate strategy. Their brains are just wired to fight it. In this episode, Salesforce change leader and neuroscience expert Travis Hahler shares insights from his new book, Rethink Resistance. Discover the biological reasons why 70% of corporate transformations fail and how leaders can stop fighting human nature and start working with it. My conversation with Travis is coming right up, but first, Travis Hahler, welcome to On Brand.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Great to be here.
So, you've earned the nickname of the Resistance Fortune Teller. So, when you look at Fortune 500 company marketing embarking on a pivot, what are the first biological warning signs you notice that tell you that an initiative's about to go off the rails?
Well, our brains don't like change, and that's the whole premise of the book. That's the whole premise of everything that I do in the neuroscience realm, is that our brains hate change. And so we oftentimes ignore that as we're launching these new things, and we're thinking about how we're bringing something to the world, whether that's internally or externally. But the for me, when I'm looking at an organization, I'm like, where are we going to find the bumps? It's typically where we're asking people to move away from something really familiar. And that could be habits. That could be, we're asking you to change something by, adopting a new technology or going to a new platform or doing something different like that. Or it could be something inherently that we don't always see. It could be something around a relational perspective that someone has. It could be something around, a connection that they have and control that they have around something. It can be just simply the loss that occurs as we have to make movement. And when you see organizations that haven't maybe accepted or thought about that perspective, that's typically where I can very quickly see where things are going to start to go off the rails, because we haven't addressed it and we haven't really thought through it. And without doing that, people really can't move through that loss or through that grief into whatever it's going to be.
So, what I am fascinated by in your work and the book is the brain science of it all. And we hear a lot about the amygdala, the threat center. How does something like a new initiative, a reorg, uh, trigger what almost to your brain feels like a physical threat?
It's a great question. And this is, I would say that was the question that I started really digging into kind of in the middle of my career, shall we say. But it was really based in my background, which is in that neuroscience and psychology and behavioral psych space. With what our brains really are doing. And if we zoom out, we think of our brains as very, complex, and they do all these wonderful things. Like we can have this conversation, we can read music, all the things we can do. But if you zoom out and you really think about what the purpose of your brain is, the purpose of your brain is to make sure that you survive. It's to keep you alive. That's the purpose of it. That's why it has all these incredible things that it can do. That's why it's so able to move through all these incredible challenges. That's why it can think the way it does. But the essence of it is to keep us alive. When we're brought something that challenges our kind of status quo or the way that we are operating, our brain is not looking at it to say, is this a good change? Should I be logically going for this? Does this logically make sense to me? It's not looking at it like that. What it's looking at is, in this moment, what do I know to be true? And how does this disruption, this change, how does this either create threat or opportunity? And most often, your brain is looking at it from a threat perspective because its operating system is keep us alive. So it's always saying, okay, what's the worst case scenario that's going to happen here? And so in those moments, your brain is really saying, we got to prepare for this. We have to be ready to kind of battle against this, fight, flight, all of that. And so our brains in these moments of change are going through and saying, all right, we have to maintain our survival. And everything that we know from thousands of years of, being humans is that there are some things that we hold as critical parts of staying alive. Things like being included in social situations, being part of a group is a survival tactic, right? Being able to look at a scenario or look at your environment and detect threat is why your amygdala is so active. That's part of survival, right? We've learned that over, thousands of years. So change by definition disrupts kind of those status quo moments, and status quo is very safe for our brain.
Well, and I think that's a big unlock too, and kind of makes the task even more daunting because I think we think of change in an organization of, my work is to get someone to adopt this new idea. But it sounds like, from what you're saying, that it's not just, hey, blank slate, adopt a new idea. It is overcoming the fact that it really kind of sounds like we are wired to resist change, that it more often than not is a threat in that fight or flight response.
It is. We are wired for resistance. And funny enough, that was the title of the keynote that kind of started a lot of this. But we are wired to resist, and that's, I think, the biggest thing for leaders. And as I've gone through my career and thinking through this kind of perspective on change and how people change, that's the one thing that kind of came to the forefront, was that our leaders don't understand that their people are wired to resist what's happening, that they are just inherently going to naturally resist anything that comes to them. And I oftentimes say at the very beginning of any talk I'm doing, any workshop, I say, here's the reality. We think of resistance as a choice. That's what we've been taught, right? We've been taught that people are resistant, they're resistors. It is a choice that we're creating. The realities of resistance is that it's a natural process within our brains, within our bodies. And so every human will resist change at a varying level. And we have to walk into the room expecting resistance and assuming resistance, and come with the tools and the capabilities and the support that are going to help people who are going to naturally feel that resistance to start working through that process of moving forward. And that is a huge shift for a lot of leaders. We have never been taught that way. We've always been taught battle the resistance.
So you talk about reframing that and walking into the room with the right tools. Given this wiring for resistance, what are some of the things that leaders can do to set the stage accordingly?
The secret here is that it's actually nothing here is a secret. And I tell this to a lot of very seasoned leaders when I walk into a room and they're like, tell us all the secret sauce of how we can do this. And I say, I'm going to really disappoint you. Nothing I'm going to tell you is actually something that you haven't either learned the hard way or heard before. It's the framing of the neuroscience. It's the framing of the natural resistance that makes it different. It's the understanding of where it comes from. And I say that even to people whose entire jobs are to do change and to help people through change. You've been taught the mechanisms that overcome resistance, but you haven't been taught why they overcome resistance. And that's like being given a tool set and having never been told what a bolt is, right? Like, it got all the tools, but you don't actually know what you use them for, right? And so when I talk to our leaders and we talk about some of these ways of overcoming natural resistance, it's not going to be anything earth-shattering. So it's things like, we need to have time for people to actually adopt the new way of working. And what I mean by that is build new habits. They need time to engage with it. They need time to set aside their current role and actually learn. Learning is a very intensive process in our brains, and we don't give that enough credit and enough space. It's things like inclusion and ensuring that when we're rolling out changes, when we're trying to transform organizations, that we're creating an inclusive space for our people. And now a lot of leaders get very anxious when I say that. And I usually have it's a two-part. One is inclusion, but let me define inclusion. Inclusion does not mean that you take 80,000 people like we have at Salesforce and you bring them all into a room and you say, Nick, how do you feel about it? Travis, how do you feel about it? That's not inclusion. It is at a very large scale. But what I mean when I say inclusion is you provide the opportunities for people to include themselves, not necessarily that you have to physically include everyone. And this could be as simple as, and quite frankly, the science tells us it's as simple as creating moments to opt in and self-identify. So even sending out the email, the announcement to say, here's what we're doing, here's how we think it'll impact you. By the way, if you have questions, concerns, if this doesn't resonate, click here. And you can actually, fill out a form. Whatever that looks like, that is enough inclusion in a lot of cases for people to feel like, oh, okay, like if something's the matter, I have a place to go. So it's things that we know, it's things that inherently we've learned. It's really just reframing the why they work and when to bring them is the key here.
On Brand will be right back after this. Now, back to the show. So you talk about reframing and taking the time to create inclusive environments where learning is possible. But another thing that we get wrong is often trying to inject a sense of urgency and speed, which feels like it might be an important thing to do in messaging. Especially I'm thinking of like my marketing hat on. But when it comes to leading people, it sounds like speed can have a detrimental effect as well.
It can. And I think a lot of us have been taught as we're making bold changes and we're, even bringing products to market is that, you have to create the burning platform, right? The thing that's going to move people quickly. And we saw that at a huge scale during like the COVID-19 pandemic, as an example. The burning platform moved millions of people to remote and to adapt to a completely new way of life and working in a very, very short period of time, weeks, actually. So it's effective, but sustaining that and creating that as the constant of how we're moving change at organizations doesn't work. And it's because, one, if everything's urgent, nothing's urgent, right? So you kind of lose the like 911 call validity moment of like, when we really do have a problem that we really do need to be urgent about, everyone's like, maybe not. We hear that every week, right? So you kind of lose that like specialty of the urgency, one. Two, as we talked about, you do need time for people to actually adopt changes and learn how to do something different and do something new. And if everything is urgent, no one's ever really taking the time to learn it. So what actually ends up happening in many cases is that people will quietly conform, meaning they will make it seem like they're conforming to the new way of working. But in reality, what they're doing on the back end is they're performatively doing what needs to be done to make it look like they have done that. And what ends up ultimately happening is that they're actually doing more work. So you're not actually receiving that return on investment of whether that's time savings or additional revenue, whatever it is that this change is bringing about for your organization or for your product, whatever that might be. You're not actually going to gain that. And the perfect example that I use is when people try to roll out like a brand new CRM system or some system that's highly complex. They put it in, people quietly conform and go, yep, sure, I'll use that. And then in the background, they're still filling out their spreadsheet on the side and just plugging in the numbers that they need to plug in to the new CRM and system to make it look like when you pull your numbers that all their stuff is in there. The reality is they're still working from a spreadsheet and you're getting absolutely none of the ROI. Actually, you're getting negative ROI because they have to do it twice, right? So that's what you see when you depend on urgency as your key change lever.
So, speaking of change levers, you talk about moving people from a point A to a point B towards change. And one tool that we talk about a lot is storytelling. And I wonder about story as a tool of moving people toward change that leaders can utilize.
Absolutely. Storytelling is essential. Narrative building is essential. People not only resonate with stories and with narratives, but quite frankly, it's how we're wired to interpret our world. And so, if you're not creating the narrative, if you're not creating the story, they are. And oftentimes, and what I talk a lot about in the book is clear and transparent communication. And there's a need for both clarity and transparency, but what it really comes down to is you're trying to provide a clear and transparent narrative or story that people can attach to. And if you're not, they're going to start building a story. Their story, and here's the kicker, will lean negative because they're trying to think about it from a what's the worst case scenario that I need to be prepared for mentality versus an opportunistic mentality. And so theirs is never going to be positive in the way that you would hope it would be.
I think that's such an important point, and kind of it's a crossover because when it comes to brand building, if you are not doing the work, someone else is going to do it for you. Same thing, often negative, or at least not what we'd prefer. But in this specific instance of leaders creating change, and I think this kind of dovetails back to that predilection that we have for resistance. And that the resistance story in the brain, driven by the fight or flight response, is going to create another more firmly entrenched story of we need to stay right here. Mm-hmm. So it's really on the leader to provide a path to another way, another story, another future. How can we do that in a way that kind of frees them up from the gravitational pull of the old story and moves them into the future?
So the way that I talk about this a lot, and quite frankly, the way that organizations speak is oftentimes in the used car salesman mentality. And I can say that because I'm the son of a car dealer without any, I'm allowed. But what we do, and the way that I usually put it up on the screen is there's 4 quadrants of how you communicate a change. The first 2 quadrants are why now and why, like what it's going to do that's positive. Those are the first 2 quadrants. Most leaders stop after those 2 quadrants. And so everything feels like a sales pitch. Every time you're talking, it feels like everyone's waiting to say, okay, I get it. I get why this is good. I get why now. But that can't be it, right? It feels like you're being sold something that you're not getting the full truth on. And so you're looking at the car and you're saying, okay, you're telling me it's all great. You're telling me, but like, there's got to be something wrong with it. It's a 10-year-old car. Like there's got to be something that's happened to it or something random, right? And that's where quadrants 3 and 4 come in. Quadrant 3 is here's what this change will not solve. And here's what might actually be worse when we make this change. And quadrant 4 is here are the things that are important to you that aren't changing at all. So those are really important things for leaders to acknowledge because one, it rounds out the message, it rounds out the narrative to say, here's why it's great, here's why now. Also, here's what we know is going to be hard. It acknowledges that loss, it acknowledges the difficulty. And then it also acknowledges what's important that's not going to change and stays the same. So, to your point about the gravitational pull, that's their like, don't worry, the gravitational pull is still there with what you like. It's just these things are changing over here. So it creates this feeling of like Earth versus moon. Like the moon's changing, but the Earth stays the same, right? So your gravitational pull is still there.
And as you described quadrants 3 and 4, in my mind, I heard if you do that, then you make it for the other party, it's safe to move. It kind of frees up that fight or flight response. We're gonna survive because these things that we like aren't going to be jeopardized. And we get to move towards a better path that if we do nothing, there's unintended consequences there too.
Yeah, and I would add one more thing. It actually injects the empathy that leaders need to have within changes. So that's why quadrant 3 is so critical. Quadrant 3 is the moment where you acknowledge that there are things that might get worse and things that won't change. And that is the empathy of saying, I know what your experience is. I feel your experience and I'm acknowledging that experience. And that makes it safe to move. Because if someone feels seen, heard, validated, they're far more likely to make that move with you rather than staying where they are. Because they're like, oh, this person sees me and knows what I'm going to go through. I can follow that person because they have seen me and they know what I'm going to go through, and I can trust that they understand it.
You know, it almost seems like the big label that this falls under, which is change and or transformation, or call it what you will. But really, what is happening, what should be happening from as your work demonstrates, is leaders need to make it safe to move. I think that's an important shift to think about, that those traditional levers just don't solve for.
You're absolutely right. And that empathy is so critical. I think that's why, when I look at leaders of change, if you have a very highly empathetic, like high EQ leader, that transformation is going to go far better than other leaders. And it's because they're naturally kind of gravitating towards what's the experience of someone else. How do I put myself in someone else's shoes? And if we really get down to basics here, change management, transformation management, it's, if you just renamed it empathy, it's kind of the same thing, right? It's all about putting yourself in the shoes of the recipient and saying, what do they need? How is this going to land for them? What do we need to bring for them? What support can we provide for them? It's all empathy, just wrapped up in methodologies and frameworks.
Yeah, and those are different tools than the levers of a car dealer or a command and control leader, too.
Yes, very much so.
So I have smiled many times during our conversation, but it is now my turn, Travis, to get to ask you for a brand that has made you smile recently.
Oh, lots of brands that I interact with every day. But one brand that I think has been consistently delivering for me, that every time I go and interact with it, I'm like, gosh, I leave happier than I started, is Anthropic. In the last like 2 months, a lot of the updates that they've made, the launch of co-work, and like some of the support that they've brought with it has been so interesting. And I've found myself smiling while learning, which is not super typical of products, especially in the tech market. So I'm really been enthused by what they've been doing in the last couple of months, and it's been a smile moment that's brought a little joy into the like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it can do that kind of mentality.
I love that. Great example. So, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Well, I know we'll have links in the below the video, but feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I read all my own messages. That's why it probably takes me forever to get back to some people. But I do love to connect on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear how this resonates for you, what you're seeing in your own organizations, how you've dealt with this in your situations as well. So LinkedIn, as well as my website, which is just travishahler.com. And that has information on me, the book, speaking, other podcasts and media that I've done as well. So feel free to connect with me.
Awesome. And we will link up to all of that in our show notes, which folks can always find at onbrandpodcast.com. Travis Hahler, thanks for being on brand with us.
Thanks so much, Nick.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.